Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there is almost certainly a jar of it. Dusty, forgotten, wedged behind the cinnamon. Last year, the world traded more than 4 million metric tons of it, a market worth over $5 billion, and somewhere in a hospital right now, a doctor is quietly recommending it over a pharmaceutical. Because, unlike most of what sits in your medicine cabinet, this one has been tested for roughly 3,000 years. We are talking about ginger, not saffron, not black pepper, not the glamorous spices that get all the documentaries. A gnarled, unassuming root that looks like it was dug up by accident, and yet has been smuggled, taxed, hoarded, weaponized, and fought over by empires that would otherwise have had nothing to do with each other. So how does that happen? How does a knobby rhizome that most of us grate into cookies end up rerouting trade routes, funding monarchies, and, according to one persistent legend, standing between medieval Europe and total annihilation by plague? That last part, we should say now, is not entirely true. But what actually happened is stranger, and in some ways darker, than the legend. This is the story of how ginger went from a sacred offering in ancient Chinese temples to a currency more valuable than gold by weight. How Roman customs officials taxed it like contraband. How it was used to justify colonization and enslavement on plantations most people have never heard of. And how the very spice merchants who built fortunes on it lied, price fixed, and covered up exactly where it came from. There are sailors in this story who died chasing it. There are monarchs who tried to monopolize it and failed spectacularly. There are outsiders, disruptors, and at least one whistleblower who exposed a trade built on rot beneath the surface. Stick around, because by the end of this, you will never look at a cup of ginger tea the same way again. To understand how ginger became a global obsession, you have to go back roughly 3,000 years to the river valleys of southern China, where farmers first began cultivating a knotted fibrous root that grew low to the ground and smelled, when broken open, like fire wrapped in citrus. The Chinese called it jiang, and they did not treat it as a garnish. They treated it as medicine, as ritual object, and as a marker of social and bodily order. Confucius himself is recorded as having never been without ginger at meals, a detail preserved in the Analects, where his dietary habits are documented with a level of specificity usually reserved for far more consequential men. He ate it, reportedly, with almost every dish, believing it aided digestion and maintained the balance of the body. That single detail tells you something important. In ancient China, what you ate was not incidental. It was moral, medical, and cosmological all at once, and ginger sat right at the center of that intersection. Traditional Chinese medicine classified ginger as a warming agent, something that stoked the body's internal fire, improved circulation, and expelled what practitioners called cold or dampness from the system. It was prescribed for nausea, for colds, for sluggish digestion, for what we would now casually call a stomach bug. Dried and fresh ginger were even considered different substances entirely, used for different ailments, a distinction that shows just how refined the understanding of this root had already become before Europe had any concept of it at all. Meanwhile, in India, ginger was undergoing its own parallel transformation. Ayurvedic medicine, one of the oldest continuously practiced healing systems in the world, referred to ginger as Vishwabhasaj, a term that translates roughly to universal medicine. Think about that for a second. Not a medicine. The medicine. Ayurvedic texts prescribed it for joint pain, respiratory trouble, poor circulation, and inflammation, and practitioners combined it with other roots and spices in complex formulations meant to restore balance among the body's three doshas. It was not just consumed, it was ritualized, dried in the sun, ground by hand, stored with ceremony, and passed between generations of healers as both knowledge and inheritance. In both civilizations, ginger carried weight far beyond flavor. It moved through temples, medical texts, and royal kitchens long before it ever touched a trade ledger. It was sensory, in a way that demanded attention. The sharp bite on the tongue, the heat that spread through the chest, the smell that lingered on hands and in kitchens for hours after preparation. That sensory intensity is not incidental to the story. It is precisely why ginger did not stay local. Something that potent, that useful, and that memorable was never going to remain confined to the valleys where it was first pulled from the soil. It was going to travel. And once it started moving west along ancient trade networks, everything about how the world valued it began to change. Somewhere around the 2nd century BC, ginger left home. Not by choice, of course. Roots don't choose anything. It was carried, quite literally, on the backs of camels and in the holds of merchant ships, passed hand to hand along the sprawling network of caravan routes we now romantically call the Silk Road, though the merchants moving through it were rarely thinking about silk. And even less about romance. They were thinking about margins. Ginger traveled dried, its moisture stripped out to survive months of jostling transit through deserts and mountain passes, and that single practical necessity, drying the root for preservation, accidentally invented an entirely new commodity category, the spice, as a durable, storable, shippable unit of wealth. A fresh root rots, a dried one appreciates. And once something appreciates, someone will always figure out how to tax it. By the time ginger reached the Mediterranean, it had already changed hands a dozen times, through Central Asian traders, Persian middlemen, and Arab merchants who understood something the Chinese and Indian producers upstream never fully controlled. Whoever manages the root manages the price. Arab traders in particular became so central to the ginger supply chain into the Roman world that they deliberately obscured its true origins, spinning tales of dangerous mountains and monster-guarded forests to justify the markup and discourage anyone from cutting out the middlemen. This wasn't folklore for folklore's sake. It was, quite literally, ancient trade secrecy dressed up as myth. The Romans, for their part, adored ginger the way they adored most imported luxuries, extravagantly, and mostly among people who could afford to be extravagant. Roman physicians like Dioscorides catalogued it as a digestive aid and warming agent, echoing, whether they knew it or not, conclusions Chinese and Indian healers had reached centuries earlier. But in Rome, ginger wasn't primarily medicine. It was status. It showed up on tax registers. It was subject to import duties recorded in places like the Digest of Justinian centuries later, a legal detail that tells you everything about how seriously empires took the movement of small, dried roots across their borders. Think about that for a second. An empire that conquered most of the known world found it worthwhile to write laws specifically about taxing ginger. That is not the behavior of a society that considered this a minor kitchen ingredient. By the time the Roman Empire fell, and Arab trading networks expanded further under Islamic caliphates, ginger had become fully embedded in a global economic mechanism. Grown in Asia, taxed by intermediaries, shipped through Arabian and Mediterranean ports, and sold in Europe at prices that had multiplied many times over from the farm gate. Nobody in a Roman market ever met a ginger farmer. They met the fourth or fifth trader in a chain specifically designed to keep it that way. This is the moment ginger stopped being a root and became a financial instrument. And every empire that touched it after this point would try, in one way or another, to own that instrument outright. Fast forward roughly 700 years, and ginger walks straight into the deadliest chapter of European history, the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia in the 14th century. Here is where popular history likes to plant a tidy little legend. The story goes that ginger, already prized and expensive, became the plague-era wonder drug, a root so potent that eating it or brewing it into tea could ward off infection entirely, and that King Henry VIII himself supposedly endorsed it as a defense against the sickness. It is a satisfying story. A single spice, standing between civilization and total collapse. It is also, when you actually go looking for the documentation, mostly wishful thinking dressed up as history. Let's be precise about what the record actually shows. Ginger absolutely appears in medieval pharmacopoeias and plague treatises from the period. That part is true. Physicians writing plague remedies in the 14th and 15th centuries did include ginger in their recommended compounds, usually mixed with other warming spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, based on the prevailing medical theory of the time, which held that plague spread through miasma, or bad air, and that warming, drying substances could fortify the body's humors against it. So ginger was part of the treatment landscape. What it was not was a cure. There is no documented case, no surviving medical record, of ginger stopping transmission of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium actually responsible for the plague, a discovery that would not even be made until the 1890s, more than 5 centuries later. Medieval physicians had no concept of bacteria. They were treating symptoms and following theoretical models that we now know were wrong. Ginger's actual documented effects were limited to what modern medicine still credits it for: aiding digestion, easing nausea, and providing warming, stimulant sensations that made sick and frightened people feel marginally more comfortable. That is a real effect. It is also nowhere close to curing one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. So why does the legend persist? Because it is a better story than the truth, and because ginger's genuine reputation as a medicinal powerhouse in Chinese and Ayurvedic traditions made it easy to graft an even bigger myth onto an already impressive root. The plague cure legend tells us less about ginger's actual pharmacology and much more about how desperate, terrified populations will attach hope to anything with a track record, however thin the actual evidence. Strip away the legend, and what remains is still remarkable. A spice trusted across 3 continents for 2 millennia to treat real, documented ailments. It just never stopped the Black Death. Nothing did, except time, quarantine, and eventually, science. By the 13th century, ginger was no longer a rumor whispered along caravan routes. It was a documented obsession. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who spent roughly 2 decades traveling through Asia between 1271 and 1295, recorded in his accounts seeing ginger growing in the Chinese provinces he passed through, describing it as abundant and cheap at the source, in sharp contrast to the fortune it commanded once it reached European markets. That gap between what a spice cost where it grew and what it sold for after 5 or 6 middlemen took their cut was the entire business model of the medieval spice trade, and ginger sat near the top of the price list alongside pepper and cloves. Polo's writings did something dangerous to the merchants who had spent centuries guarding that gap, they demystified the source. Once European readers understood that ginger was an ordinary agricultural crop grown by ordinary farmers, and not some semi-magical substance harvested from monster-guarded valleys, the incentive to cut out the middlemen became irresistible. Monarchs took notice. Spice imports, ginger included, were taxed at ports across medieval Europe, with customs duties on pepper and ginger recorded as significant revenue sources for English and French crowns by the 14th century. Controlling the flow of spice was not just commerce, it was statecraft. Whoever controlled the ports controlled the tax base, and whoever controlled the tax base could fund armies. This is why, by the late 1400s, the search for a direct sea route to Asian spice markets became a matter of national priority rather than private enterprise. Portugal, under royal sponsorship, pushed explorers down the African coast and around it, chasing a route that would let them buy ginger, pepper, and cloves directly from Asian producers and sell them in Europe, without Arab and Venetian intermediaries taking their historic cut. Spain, locked out of the eastern route by Portuguese claims, funded a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, who sailed west in 1492, hoping to reach the same Asian spice markets from the opposite direction. He did not find Asia. He found the Caribbean instead, and in the process he stumbled onto something almost as consequential as the spice route he had failed to open: land, and lots of it, land that European powers would soon realize was suitable for growing the very crops they had been fighting over for centuries. Ginger made that transatlantic leap early. Spanish colonists introduced it to the Caribbean by the early 1500s, and within decades, Jamaica was exporting ginger back to Europe, undercutting the old Asian supply chains entirely. The outsiders had won, not through diplomacy, not through treaties, but by planting the crop somewhere the old monopolies could never touch it. Now, before we cross the Atlantic and watch this story get considerably darker, let's pause for a second. If you're the kind of person who finds it fascinating that a knobby little route nearly rewrote the map of the world, that's exactly the kind of history this channel digs up, week after week. So if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because there are a lot more of these hiding in your kitchen cabinet than you'd think. Salt, sugar, black pepper, even the humble potato have body counts and empires attached to them that nobody teaches you in school. Think about that for a second, the spice rack as a crime scene. Ginger just happens to be one of the oldest offenders. And it's worth sitting with how strange that is. We are talking about a root that most people today associate with soothing an upset stomach or flavoring a holiday cookie, and yet for well over 1,000 years it was fought over with the same intensity nations usually reserve for gold, territory, or religion. Kings taxed it. Sailors died chasing it. Middlemen built entire fortunes on lying about where it came from. And we've barely gotten to the worst part yet. Because what happens next, once ginger crosses the ocean and takes root in the Caribbean, is not a story about clever merchants outsmarting monopolies anymore. It's a story about the human cost of demand, about what empires are willing to do to people when a crop becomes profitable enough. The outsiders who broke the old spice monopolies didn't do it alone. They did it by putting other human beings to work under conditions history has not been kind to remember accurately. So subscribe if you want the rest of this, because it gets uncomfortable before it gets redemptive. And that arc, from ritual to commodity to exploitation to reckoning, is really the whole reason ginger's history is worth telling at all. With that said, let's go back to Jamaica in the 16th century, where Spanish colonists just realized They were sitting on a gold mine that happened to look like an ugly brown root, and where the next chapter of this story starts getting written not in trade ledgers and royal decrees, but in the backs and hands of enslaved laborers who would make ginger one of the first non-native crops successfully industrialized in the New World. Jamaica in the 1500s was a laboratory for a new kind of economy, and ginger was its first successful test case. Spanish colonists had already stumbled onto the fact that the island's climate, warm, wet, forgiving, could grow ginger rhizomes faster and denser than anything coming out of Asia. The problem was labor. Ginger is not a crop that harvests itself. Each rhizome has to be dug by hand, washed, scalded or limed to prevent sprouting, then dried or preserved in syrup for export, a process that is repetitive, back-breaking, and endless. So the same colonial system that was already trafficking enslaved Africans across the Atlantic for sugar simply folded ginger into the same machine. By the middle of the 16th century, ginger had become one of the first crops grown in the Americas, specifically for the European market using enslaved labor, and Jamaica was exporting it back across the Atlantic in volumes that dwarfed anything the old Asian trade routes had ever managed. Think about that inversion for a second. A root that Confucius ate with reverence, that Ayurvedic physicians dried and ground with ritual care, that Arab traders once wrapped in myths of monsters and mountains to protect its mystique, was now being produced the way you produce anything, once profit outweighs everything else, at scale, by force, and as fast as human bodies could be made to work. The ritual was gone. What replaced it was a ledger entry. Spanish and later English colonial administrators tracked ginger exports the same way they tracked sugar and tobacco, as a line item, a yield per acre, a number that went up when the labor was pushed harder. And push it they did. Historical accounts describe enslaved workers on Caribbean plantations processing ginger under grueling conditions, the crop demanding constant attention during planting and an intense, punishing labor spike during harvest and curing season. This was not incidental cruelty. It was structural. The entire economic logic of the plantation system depended on treating human beings as an input to be depreciated, not a population to be protected, and ginger, unglamorous as it looked sitting in a barrel, was built on exactly that same foundation as the crops we more readily associate with slavery's horrors. By the 17th century, ginger cultivation had also taken root in parts of Southeast Asia under European colonial administration, further globalizing the supply chain and ensuring that no single region and no single empire could corner the market the way Arab and Venetian middlemen once had. The old bottlenecks were gone. Ginger was no longer scarce, no longer mysterious, no longer the exclusive luxury of monarchs and physicians. It was becoming what sugar, tobacco, and cotton had already become: an industrial commodity, produced continuously, shipped in bulk, and priced for a growing consumer middle class back in Europe, who had no idea, and frankly no interest in knowing, what conditions had produced the jar sitting in their kitchen. That ignorance, as we'll see, would not last forever. That ignorance could survive as long as the supply chain stayed hidden. It could not survive forever. As the plantation system matured across the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, the same colonial administrators who logged ginger exports as tidy line items alongside sugar and tobacco were, whether they admitted it or not, sitting on a ledger of exploitation. And ledgers have a way of eventually being read by people who were not supposed to see them. Abolitionist movements in Britain and elsewhere gathering force through the late 18th and into the 19th century, did not single out ginger the way they singled out sugar, but the root traveled through the exact same plantation apparatus, harvested by the exact same coerced hands. And when that system was finally dismantled through the gradual abolition of slavery across the British colonies, ginger production did not disappear. It adapted. Planters shifted from enslaved labor to indentured labor, importing workers under contracts that promised wages and passage but often delivered debt, isolation, and conditions barely distinguishable from what had come before. The commodity survived the reform. It simply found new bodies to move through it. This is the quiet, uncomfortable pattern that runs underneath so much of commodity history. The crop outlives the century's official moral reckoning with how it was grown, because demand does not pause for conscience. European and American consumers kept buying ground ginger, ginger syrup, ginger beer, and candied ginger root by the ton. And for a long time the industry itself controlled the story, deciding what the public did and did not need to know about wages, working conditions, and who actually profited from each pound sold at market. Price manipulation compounded the problem. Middlemen, brokers, and export houses in colonial ports set purchase prices for raw ginger with little transparency and even less negotiating power left in the hands of the growers, actually pulling rhizomes out of the ground, a dynamic that echoed the old Arab and Venetian markups from 1,000 years earlier, except now dressed in the language of modern trade rather than ancient mystery. It took the broader 20th century wave of labor reporting, agricultural unionization, and post-colonial independence movements to start prying that opacity open, region by region, as newly sovereign nations began asserting control over their own export economies rather than functioning as extraction zones for European markets. Out of that slow unwinding came the modern fair trade movement, which by the late 20th century was explicitly targeting commodity crops like ginger alongside coffee, cocoa, and bananas, pushing for certification schemes designed to guarantee growers a floor price and marginally better conditions, even if enforcement remained, and still remains, uneven at best. And as the old colonial plantation model lost its grip, production itself redistributed. China, ginger's ancient birthplace, re-emerged as the world's dominant grower and exporter. India followed close behind, drawing on the same millennia-old Ayurvedic relationship with the root that had never actually gone away. And Nigeria rose rapidly to become one of the largest ginger-producing nations on the African continent. A geographic reshuffling that would have been unthinkable to the Portuguese crown, or the Jamaican sugar and ginger planters who once assumed they held a permanent grip on the trade. The empires that fought over ginger are gone. The root simply moved on without them. So think back to that jar sitting in your kitchen cabinet, the one with the faded label and the powder that has probably been there longer than you would like to admit. Or the mug of ginger tea you drink when your stomach is off. The same remedy Ayurvedic physicians were prescribing under the name Vishwabhesaj, universal medicine, long before anyone had a word for globalization. 4 million metric tons of that root move around the planet every single year now. More than $5 billion changing hands for something that grows wild and gnarled in the dirt. That number opened this story. It should hit differently now. Because that jar is not just a spice. It is Confucius eating it with nearly every meal recorded in the Analects. It is Arab and Persian traders inventing myths about its origin just to justify the markup. It is Roman legal scholars writing tax codes around it in the Digest of Justinian. It is medieval doctors stuffing it into plague remedies they did not understand, working off wrong theories against a disease that killed up to 200 million people, and getting credit they never actually earned. It is Marco Polo watching it grow cheap and plentiful in Chinese fields and realizing the whole luxury reputation back home was built on artificial scarcity. It is Portuguese caravels and Spanish galleons, an entire age of exploration partly bankrolled by the hunt for cheaper access to it. One of those voyages accidentally bumping into the Caribbean instead. It is enslaved men and women in Jamaica digging, washing, and scalding rhizomes by hand to feed European demand, and indentured laborers inheriting that same brutal task generations later under contracts that barely improved on bondage. It is brokers and export houses quietly pocketing the difference between what a farmer was paid and what a consumer spent, a pattern old enough to trace back to those first Silk Road-era middlemen. It is unions, independence movements, and fair trade certifications slowly, imperfectly, trying to claw some fairness back into a system built on extraction. And it is China, India, and Nigeria now growing and exporting it on their own terms, in a trade the old empires no longer control. None of that history is visible in the jar. That is precisely the point. The most ordinary objects in your kitchen are almost never as simple as they look, and ginger might be the single best proof of that rule in the entire spice cabinet. Empires rose chasing it, empires fell without it, plagues were blamed and unblamed on it, and human beings were bought, sold, and worked half to death over it. Also that today you can toss a spoonful into a cup of hot water and never think about any of that at all. That is the real power of ginger. Not that it cured plagues, because it never did. Its real power is quieter and stranger than that. The power to move empires, enslave labor, fund voyages, and rewrite trade routes, all while looking, the entire time, like nothing more than a wrinkled brown root.